Hello and welcome to yet another edition of my Yap Corner. I guess that's just gonna stick now. I'll do better. As always, I'm Dan Pixel. I have a fake doctorate in emotional damage and thematic narratives in fantasy. Today we are going to be talking about the end of Life is Strange Double Exposure, which is actually a little bit controversial and I have had fluctuating opinions on. Obviously, this will include big spoilers, so if you have not finished the game, fruit snacks are that way. Now, as I mentioned in my almost immediate reaction video the night that I finished playing, I was sort of taken aback by what I can only describe as a sharp right turn in the final moments of the narrative. I had felt that the entire final sequence of The Eye of the Storm was leading up to Safi realizing that her own inability to let go was making things worse for everyone and putting Max into this position where she was being forced to choose again. And even though Max was trying to reject it, it may or may not work. And so Safi was going to do something Chloe could never do, which is take the choice into her own hands. To me, during this playthrough, the act and sequence of pulling Safi out of the other members of the cast using the camera to do double exposure shots was a commentary on grief and how a piece of you stays left behind in everyone that you leave behind you, which is why I was nearly sobbing when we got to the last one, and I guessed pretty early on that the last piece of Safi was going to be inside Max and that she would need to take a selfie to pull her out. What I thought was going to happen next was that Safi was going to have died the first time. There was never going to be a living world. It was going to go back to an original split, but this time Max would be able to handle the guilt because she knew that she could let it go, and more importantly, this was Safi's direct decision. Now, obviously, that is not what happened, and I will not be judging a game for doing something that I didn't think they should do. That's not the same thing as a critique, so I have to take a look at what they did do and rate its effectiveness. That sharp right turn immediately afterwards, where you come back into the more like reality outside of the Eye of the Storm, got a little strange for me because I didn't understand why Safi was behaving with the tone she was behaving, nor did I directly understand what the final decision was supposed to be at the time. And the general consensus on its interpretation is seemed to be a kind of like Xavier Magneto thing in which you can either embrace an antagonist or reject them. And because I was so shaken by the abrupt shift from where I thought we had been going to where we did go, I too thought that this was what was being suggested. And that on top of that, with the, Max Caulfield will return, really made it feel like we were looking at some MCU shit. However, sometime around like 1 a.m. last night while I was thinking on it, I had another realization. Now, I have already said before that Max and Safi are like photo negatives of each other. In so many ways, Safi is just like Max in that she lost the person most important to her and could not move on or let go. However, one of the major themes of double exposure is absolution and Max moving on from her own guilt, and the way that I realized they did that is in that same Eye of the Storm sequence. The difference between, as I mentioned before, the Eye of the Storm and the Long Walk is that in the Eye of the Storm, Max is not alone. It is over the course of the game and in that final sequence that Max has realized and accepted that she cannot do everything by herself and relinquishes her grip on that which was. Something that she feels comfortable doing because she has people she trusts around her who know her. She becomes more stable the more she trusts in other people. While part of the lesson and what makes Safi Max's photo negative is that she finds herself unable to let go, the reason that she finds herself unable to let go is because she feels isolated and alone. Even though some of the things that Safi is saying in the final scene feel a little supervillainy, like I'm not going to pretend like they don't, I don't think that's the point. The point is, up until that day, Safi thought she was alone in the world. And that rather than looking to let go of life in that conversation with Max, the final part of Eye of the Storm, what she learns to do next is build the community of her own, rather than try to blend in to communities that she does not feel a part of. Remember the trauma that inspired her power to begin with? And if that doesn't sound familiar to every queer person I know, I don't know what will. Regardless, what I actually think was supposed to be the feeling in that final scene, or at least somewhere along the way, was that Safi was inviting Max to be a part of a community so that Max didn't have to feel alone anymore, and Safi did not want to feel as though the one person who opened her up to trust was abandoning her. Nothing really says outright that Safi's going off to do crimes just because she has a power now. But because we do exist in a world where the MCU has existed for over a decade and change, it's very hard to not see that when we see some of the same signifiers. But that invitation was not an invitation to break the law and be evil. That invitation is an invitation to not be alone. Or moreover, a request to make sure that she wouldn't be alone, Safi wouldn't be alone. And one of the biggest criticisms of the scene is obviously people, for the reasons I've said, are like, well, this feels like Cape shit. And obviously Life is Strange is not Cape shit, nor should it ever be Cape shit. It was the interview with game director Jonathan Stauber who specifically touched on this again before the release happened, was his specific expression that this cannot and will not and should not be superhero fiction. Now, contexting the view of the director against that scene makes you realize that we might have taken away the incorrect thing based on culture context rather than what was actually supposed to be taken away from it. And mind you, that is a risk of creating art, that people will not take away the thing you want them to take away. You never know until it's out there in the world. In this, do I think the crafting of that final moment is probably one of the biggest weaknesses of that game, and that ambiguity, that cultural context that leads us to see things as though we are watching an Avengers movie because it dominated the cultural conversation for so long, without being specific enough to avoid it, being vague made it an assumption that many of us had. So when it comes down to it, no, I don't think that the Life is Strange franchise is going to turn into superhero shit, even though there are people screaming that the sky is falling about it. And despite first glances, I don't think that is the direction they are suggesting they are going either. However, and this is very important to understand, it is the weakness of the narrative sculpting of that very specific moment that makes it appear that it is going to be doing so. And mind you, it is my personal opinion as an artist that you should never let yourself be so unspecific or unfocused that an audience can take away something the complete opposite of what you want them to take away.